so hunger is a point of really one of the heights of vulnerability. Currently, we're in one of the biggest hunger crises since World War II. Care about food and you care about innovation, look at the smallholders.
Welcome to SDGs Decoded, SDG number 2 with Leehe Skuler, the founder of Gita. And today we're going to talk about SDG number 2, which is no poverty. And I just want to read the more detailed description of this goal, which is end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. And Leehe had the idea that I should improvise and riff on my ideas about zero hunger. And to create some sort of a polarity between her informed perspective of what's happening on the globe and her deep experience in the field, and what I have to offer to think about it. And so we're going to do that. So I'm going to just take a minute or two to lay out my initial thoughts, and then the stage is yours, Leehe. Okay, zero hunger. So I think that the larger title, containing also the sustainable agriculture, is very revealing. Because if you look at how our agricultural industry works, then it's exploitative on many levels. So the fact that we managed to create a situation, we as humanity managed to create a situation where we use patented crops to lock people into dependencies on certain organizations, while exploiting or drying out the earth, using up all of the nutrients in the earth, leading to a situation where we literally will have eaten up everything in about 60 years, or 60 harvests, which is less than 6 years, 30 years. And then using all of that to produce food that's not even good for humans. That is pretty ridiculous. And so if you look at it from the lens of, for example, Sebastian Huysman, who is one of the leading syntropic and permaculture farmers in Europe, was converted thousands and thousands of hectares of industrial farmland into syntropic farming. And by the way, there's a My Journey to Impact conversation with Sebastian. If you ask him, he can tell you that it is absolutely, entirely possible to feed the entire globe's population with syntropic farming. And syntropic farming, if you don't know that term, means that you care for the ecosystem. This is a way of farming that actually creates culture. All sorts of ecoculture, culture with humans, all of it, right? So it's a myth that we cannot, in any other way, with agriculture, feed 8 or 10 or even 12 billion people on this planet. It's an absolute myth. And the myth is driven by the market, right? Because the market is optimized towards only one function, which is a mistake in itself, and which was known when we introduced that one function, which is profit maximization through money that's attached to GDP, right? So that's a core driver, and now we've shown that we can use technology in the form of GMO, fertilizer, things like that, and machines, of course, to feed the world. Now, what we have to show is that we can also use technology to do the same thing, but also care for nature as we do this.
Yeah, that's
and
a challenge.
But it's all absolutely doable. We just have to start doing it. So that's my take. Now the stage is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So we're talking about, I think, one of the most fundamental issues that we think about, human rights and a just society, right? Not to die of hunger. This is one of the most basic things, I think, in any civilization, in any text we have, from the Bible to others, hunger is the thing that civilizations try to avoid, that good societies try to take care of. The Romans had a food program. This is like number one. SDG 3 is about health, and that's already one stage above. But having enough food not to die is the fundamental kind of promise that we try to have when we're starting to talk about societies and what societies could offer to individuals. First of all, you won't die from hunger. And it is in the, I think, basis of all organizations and in human civilizations, from the first hunter-gatherers to early agriculture, to anything along the way, and of course till we get to what you just mentioned, Thomas. This is kind of post-industrialized, hyper-capitalized markets that we have today, and that's kind of a core issue. Now, we're gonna, of course, all the SDGs are core issues. That's kind of what they are. But hunger is clearly one of the most fundamental structures that we talk about. It's also kind of the basic necessity for living, right? We need water, yes. We need air, yes. But we need food. And since it's so fundamental, again, like in other issues we talked about, it has and is a political context in many ways. And we're going to talk about it even more than poverty, I think, maybe a little less than health. But you guys can see how the SDGs are formed. The first 4 SDGs are really, really fundamental. I'd say the first 3, which again is poverty, hunger, and health, are kind of, if we would look at the SDGs as Maslow pyramid, this is the foundations. And we do have a short presentation here since we want to go over some stuff, but as we are kind of putting this information both on YouTube and maybe as podcast, and I've tried to be a little less heavy on images and more about info. And maybe we can have a follow-up session with Ms. Thomas and invite some cool people from our community, because there are a lot of people dealing with this important issue. So we're gonna dive in. Let's see. Here we go. We got hunger. SDG 2, 0 hunger. One of also the most kind of ambitious SDGs. All the rest are trying to reduce, improve, do kind of be better. 0 hunger aimed and that to get to really know people in the world started. and to talk about food security. So we're going to kind of dive into the whole implications of this story. Quick reminder, the SDGs were formed between 2012 and 2015 as a 2.0 version of the MDGs. We go over all of this kind of background and history of the SDGs in our first session on SDG 1. But it is a fascinating story, so I do recommend you go over this whole thing, because to really get what's going on in the SDGs, we have to actually understand why they were created and how they're managed. And I will remind you, it is a UN project, right? So this is governed and managed by the United Nations with participation of all nation states. What's important to remember that it is a GO, right? It's a governmental initiative. So a lot of this is managed by governments, and Zero Hunger is really one of the ones that we'll see. There's a lot of public sector engagement here for multiple levels. So just to get an understanding of the depths of the problem, we have just over a quarter to a third of the globe really without food security. And I think that is the key issue. Food security is regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. It was 2 billion in 2019, but something extraordinary and actually quite sad happened. After 2 decades of the amount of people that were hungry, both in the actual number and the relative number, was going down very, very, very steeply, to the point where, the SDGs were formed late 2015. There was this feeling that we can achieve, zero hunger within 15 years. And then that trend shifted. 2018 already, but definitely 2019. Sadly, we started seeing the amount of people hungry in the world go up. Famine in Yemen, different areas around the world really connected to climate challenges. So we see desertification and drought leads to less crop, leads to more hunger. And in this case, I didn't create this whole interconnectivity map. But if we look for a minute at the SDGs, we can see that they are very, very, very tightly connected to this question of hunger, because hunger is really a question of A, manufacturing food, and B, distributing that food. And so those are two key issues, and the climate crisis is disrupting both of those. Any kind of issue regarding global production or global markets and inflation disrupts that. And today, we're talking April 2022. We are in the midst of Russian-Ukrainian war, which is a huge disruptor in the food markets. And we'll talk about that too. So conflict, climate, markets, all those things have a direct relationship to the story of hunger. And of course, when we talk about food security, we talk about just the fact that there's people that are actually dying of hunger right now. And we have systems actually in place to deal with that. We have the World Food Program, and we have aid that deals with that. But there are a bunch of people just on the line. That means they don't have food security. That means they might have a meal right now, but they're not sure that they will have a meal within the next week. And that's when we talk about regular access. That means a week. That's the time frame we're looking at. We're not saying a year, right? Saying a person will know where their food is coming from and that it's nutritious, it's safe, and they have access to it, and it's affordable, really, in the next week. That's the level of kind of security we're talking when we define food security. And we were talking about over 2 billion people without access to food security. That means there are people that do not know where their next meal is going to come from. And they might not be starving right now, but that is just on the brink of hunger. So it seems like it's kind of a iffy or washy kind of definition, but it really isn't. You know, food security means, and hopefully the majority of us here listening, we know we have access to our next meal and the next week of food. But about almost today, almost a third of the world does not. What kind of is the flip side of that, and you mentioned it, Thomas, is that there's a third of the world, a third of the food in the world is wasted, lost, thrown away, not used properly. So we have a third of the food that is being created and grown, being thrown away. We have a third of the world without any food security. And we have a third of the people living in industrialized countries, so Western countries or richer countries, that suffer from overconsumption of food. So they are, you know, overweight, they're overconsuming sugar, they are not exercising enough. And I think to your point, Thomas, you're talking about the fact that we can absolutely reduce hunger right away. One of the key things today that we actually have enough food today to feed everyone. This is not an issue of enough food. It's more an issue of distribution. So big issues. And like we tend to do, we're going to break it down to the targets. Only 5 targets this time, not counting the extra ones. And I just want to point out a few key things here. So end on hunger and ensure access by all people, particularly poor, to safe, nutritious, sufficient food all year round. Notice that this is a year time frame. We added in the zero hunger process malnutrition because that has a huge, actually health-related issue, but of course comes from lack of access to food. Interesting enough, and we can dive into that, there is actually a lot of malnutrition in rich countries, in children in developed markets that are actually suffering from malnutrition because they consume mostly processed foods that do not give them the nutrition they need. So they're eating enough, but they don't have actually their stunted growth and they don't have all the nutritional aspects they need. 2.3, I think, is the most important one. And I'll get back to that in a minute because there's a lot of misconceptions here. But 2.3 is a big target, double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. This is, of course, focused as much as possible on fragile population, women, indigenous peoples. And it has a lot of implications because if we want to make sure that smallholder farmers or small-scale farmers are increasing their production, we have to deal with a huge issue of systemic challenges that smallholder farmers face. So, little tangent, 80% of the farmers in the world are smallholder farmers. We call a smallholder farmer or small-scale food producer, as it's defined here, someone who holds between 2 to 10 hectares. Anyone that knows anything about agriculture knows that that's a lot, but it's not a huge amount of land. And we talk about smallholder farmers typically as ones that are really running the world because a big chunk of the people in the world are smallholder farmers. And they struggle with a lot of systemic issues. First of all, access to their titles and ownership on their land. Again, huge issue in developing countries that, you know, the land in the village that you put your hut in or that you grow your food on is not legally signed to you. There's no taboo on the land. There's no titles on the land. We kind of take it for granted that you have your kind of certificate when you buy a piece of land, you can prove it. In developing countries, that haven't been done. And so that means people are very vulnerable. If a big even a big corporation comes by and you're like, oh, you guys are next to a river. That's nice. I want to create a nice paper plant here. There is no legal structure in place to protect this village. And basically, they're all just taken off their village. That land is confiscated. And these people, even if they've been living there for thousands of years, have nothing. And so definitely, if you want to kind of become a stronger farmer and make sure that all this investment you put in your land in order for it to create food is kept yours, we have to organize that kind of title. And there is a wonderful book, if anybody wants to read about this, called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, by Hernando de Soto, who actually takes the time, he's an economist, to imagine how much wealth would be in the world if we'd actually distribute these titles of land to the people that own the land across the world, and actually change the whole structure of equity and economic empowerment. So big thing here, access to land and titles. Another thing is access, and we always talk about access, but here we'll talk a little bit about access to knowledge, to financial services, and first and foremost in food is access to markets. Food, unlike shoes or paper, is perishable. If you create your food and you harvested it and you do not have access to a market to sell it, then a lot of times it just gets lost and it just dies or rots. And so there's a whole level of value chains that need to happen, and access to market for smallholder farmers is very, very low. The food markets are entirely dominated by large scale farmers, those giant plantations that have direct relationships with supermarkets, retailers. All their crops go immediately to refrigeration, and immediately to the supermarket, and then to our table. If you're not connected to that whole value chain, you do not have access to a market. So you can be a subsistent farmer, meaning you consume what you make and that's about it. But if you want to make income off whatever you farmed, it's very difficult to have access to those markets. And especially smallholder farmers who are small by definition, they don't have a lot of economic power. And big retailers and big buyers just kind of ignore them. So they're not taken into account. We'll talk about some cool tech that is trying to access that. Another thing is access to finance. So anyone who knows anything about agriculture, it is a risky business, mostly because you are dependent on the weather. The weather, especially with the climate crisis growing stronger, is, well, typically it can repeat itself, but sometimes it doesn't act like very predictable, like we predict it to be. And so if there are more rains or less rains, or if they come in a different time, anything that happens with the weather will change our crops. Again, this is basic, but think how small amount of the goods produced in the world are dependent on something so chaotic and so out of our control, like the weather. That means that if you want to actually create a business out of farming, you need some kind of insurance or some kind of financial backing in case something fluctuates with the weather. You need investments in order to buy a lot of inputs. There's a lot of access to finance that needs to happen here. And smallholder farmers typically do not have access to all those financial cool products that make it easy and like even possible to increase their productivity. And last and foremost, knowledge. A lot of farming is done on traditional basis in smallholder farmers. And again, we keep talking about smallholder farmers, and that's a key thing. Smallholder farmers typically did not go to college, are not agronomes, right? So they didn't have professional science-based education on growing food. Some of the stuff they know are incredible and very relevant to their ecosystems. And some of the stuff they know are outdated. You know, we have science, we have technology, we have new solutions on how to grow things better, on what is the best crop for this land, on what is the best seed, or on what you talked about, Thomas, you know, how do we grow ecosystems, or what we call edible forests or permaculture, or different kind of ways we talk about this stuff. But a lot of that has to do with knowledge. And smallholder farmers famously do not have access to that knowledge, since they are busy working, you know, 15 hours a day out in the field. And that actually is a huge inhibitor for them to maintain, you know, a little bit more income, a little bit more crop, and really move out of the poverty sector. So notice that we were talking about hunger, but very quickly we started talking about food production, and they're very tightly related. And 2.4, we're going to the next target. 2.4 is ensure sustainable food production systems. And here's an interesting issue. When we're trying to address hunger in general, we are talking about a systemic issue. So it's all about changing the food systems. This is super complex. The food systems is one of the most globally integrated systems in the world that we have. Yes, anything we manufacture in our, you know, global world is integrated, and the value chains are all over the place. But food really is insanely integrated. Every product and every level of creating food that will, in the end of the day, reach impoverished people who need it is completely diverse from where it comes from. You know, your sugar could come from a sugarcane plant in Brazil, but that sugarcane plant needed to buy inputs from the Czech Republic and from Russia and from the US and from local people. And that's just one ingredient. Imagine you're making a cake, right? So each of every ingredient is really from all over the place. And they're very, very interconnected, which is one of the key reasons that during the pandemic, the issue of hunger got really worse across the board. Hunger just took off. So yeah, we can talk a little bit about how we're looking at systems. And I'd say most of the tech innovation going on related to hunger today is actually addressing systemic change and kind of working with global organizations, trying to rethink how all this is going. And 2.5, I think, is really interesting because it talks about maintaining the genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants, farmed and domesticated animals with their related wild species. And really, you know, that whole thing about genetic diversity, because we know that through the climate change and climate crisis, the world is losing its diversity in all species, in all plants and matter, and definitely through in animals in very high rates. And so maintaining genetic diversity is incredible, but some people would be surprised to find it here in ending hunger. And one of the things we find is that, you know, unlike this paradigm that we've been living in since, I think, the 1950s, where the way to create less hunger is just increase food and then kind of industrialize and homogenize the whole food production and create these massive monoculture, like one crop fields. And that's something that we can be uniform about and then copy paste to do it at every place in the world. And that's how we treat hunger or food production. That was kind of the line of agriculture for, I'd say, well, forever, but maybe, you know, last 60 years, we've been pushing it really, really quickly. So, you know, take one type of wheat, do a little bit of genetic engineering to make it super resilient and super productive, and then take that one type of wheat, even though there are literally hundreds of thousands of wheats around the world, and take that and just make it the one crop used to create wheat and flour across the world. And so there was a homogeneity push for a really long time, saying, you know, just basically create food like we do, we create or manufacture cars or anything in a factory, you know, just uniform it. And what we find out is that that has a disastrous impact. So first of all, the other types in the species just get wiped out, which is difficult. But also there is strength in diversity. When we understand nature, we understand how different kind of mutations and different kind of situations and environments and ecosystems and climate thrive. And that's how we got this diversity that exists on this little planet, came from the fact that it works, that they're in different locations, we need different solutions. And only now, and now I mean like the last 10 years, there is a push to start integrating diversity again into farming and agriculture, understanding that that one type of wheat grain that we pulled out may have worked wonders in India, but is irrelevant in Mali or Bolivia, and is not a strong crop and actually has bad effects on the soil and all the other crops around it. So this is kind of a new focus when we talk about food and agriculture and hunger, to bring back all that diversity, because it actually will ensure the kind of food security that we need, and will allow smallholder farmers to grow different types of crops in different ways, in different climates, and wherever they live, instead of having this kind of uniform approach. There are international agreements about this, but this is actually one of the most difficult things to kind of reverse decades, if not centuries of work of uniformity to kind of bring back diversity. So I think there's very little achievements there. Any thoughts on this, Thomas, kind of before we go on to where we are and what is being done about this?
Well, what came up for me while you were talking is the question: what would happen if these smallholder farmers, the 80%, stopped producing for the national or even international markets, and instead started producing only for their direct environment? So currently, right now, I'm in Costa Rica, and if I help with the coffee harvest here, I work a full day to harvest about 1% of my life's coffee consumption, and I earn $2. And that's because I'm slow, so others can maybe double that. And you're working alongside a poor Nicaraguan family where the children work to make ends meet here, right? Yeah. So, and that coffee gets sent to probably Germany, because Germany is the largest exporter in the world of the refined product coffee that we know. Really? Yes. Not know that. So the actual profit is being made in Germany for coffee. And what if those same farmers stopped growing coffee, which is not growing so well anymore anyway because of climate change, and instead started producing for the local community? Then there wouldn't be so much coffee in Germany anymore, but who cares, right? Because then the people here would be a lot better off. And that's the question I have. What is the system that we need to, or does that make sense? First question. Second question, if it makes sense, how do we get a shift towards something like that?
Okay, so I'll answer question number one first. The idea to only produce locally is where we started off as civilizations, right? If I lived in Central America, I had access to bananas because local people would either grow them or grew naturally. But if I wasn't in that region, I would have never seen a banana. What we found that there are efficiencies to kind of specializations and growth. And you're living in Costa Rica, that's great. But if you're moving back to Germany, are you going to give up coffee? And will everyone who doesn't live next to a coffee plantation give up coffee? And the truth is, I don't think we're ready for that. And the truth is, I don't think that would be good. That's the second point. I don't think it would be great for the local farmers as well. We can talk about the fact that they're not getting the key profits from this industry, and that's something we can change. But the only profits that they are getting is because some German factory or post-production kind of worker is buying that coffee in bulks. If they were dependent completely on the local economy, well, Costa Rica is kind of middle income, they could have been okay. But that basically means we are sentencing poor countries to stay poor because the local community just does not have income. And we don't, if they're only selling what the local community can buy, then farmers are going to go out of business. And access to the global markets, even if they're only getting a portion of the profit, is what's allowing farmers to stay alive. That's
I want to briefly respond to that,
yeah.
because that is that rests on the definition of poverty and wealth, and we currently tend to equate that to our position as a country in the global GDP ranking. But just as a reminder, Costa Rica is ranking, while it's ranking on 80 or something like that on the GDP hit parade, it is ranking number one on the Happy Planet Index, right? Which has a
really. I thought Finland was number one.
No, the Happy Planet Index is not about the individual happiness.
Oh, Happy Planet, not happy people.
Right. It's about the subjective happiness, life expectancy at birth, ecological footprint, and a fourth measure that the Gini index, right? So these four numbers make up your Happy Planet Index, and Costa Rica is ranking number one. So it is, and there is a lot of local food production here already. So I would counter that point. I would say it's not necessary. Depends on our definition of poverty and wealth.
That's true. And as this winner of the Happy Planet Index, then this is absolutely relevant for them, and they are really literally the top. So all the rest of the countries are not in that space. Not to mention there are some, at least 100, that are very, very far from that place. So they are struggling with climate stresses. They're struggling with drought. They're struggling. They all the stuff we've just mentioned, they do not have, especially low-income countries. And the GDP is not the greatest category. And we know we should have a whole thing when we talk about GDP. But we can talk about the Happy Planet Index, or where poverty is just rampant, or hunger is rampant, and talk about the options people have there. And especially when we get to hunger, we know these are people without options, because if you are hungry and you have anything, you will eat first and foremost. And so hunger is a point of really one of the heights of vulnerability. There is really no choice. You are dependent on these systems that will allow you to be in a place where there's access to food. And we see new kind of phenomena in hunger, a lot of urban hunger. People don't have access to even subsistence farming. But any area that has extreme weathers, either in summer or in winter, you have large masses of population that are reliant on imported goods in order to live. It's not Costa Rica. So if there's a crazy winter and nothing can be grown during that winter, then and yes, you can preserve, you can dry, you can prepare a lot of food for the winter times. But in order to consume anything fresh, it will probably be imported or grown through incredible amounts of resources. A greenhouse with a lot of energy and a lot of something that not sure that makes sense. And on the other hand, if you are in a place where there's 200 days of very hot weather and no water and nothing grows, you're reliant on food from other places. So there's something I feel that has to do with justice and equity when we talk about global trade about food, because not everyone lives in like a paradise like Costa Rica. And if we are reliant on our local production, there's a whole group of people living in the equator or in the Mediterranean, but really not everyone.
Okay, so we have to solve for local artificial climate. So meaning solving the luxury problem for Germans to have coffee. Okay, that's one thing, but also solving much more importantly, of course, for regulating climate in areas where there's simply no food because of increased climate chaos, and that will just increase no matter what we do. It'll become more volatile, probably like it was for tens of thousands of years before humanity started going into agriculture. The climate seemed to have been more volatile then as well. So, and
exactly,
I want to.
And what's important to remember is, sorry, I'm just saying, during that time, human civilization did not flourish, right? So we really only started to grow in numbers after was some predictability in weather patterns that allowed a little bit of agriculture and kind of starting to be able to, create a little bit of wheat here if you are in flat land with a lot of water, and trees and fruits if you're a bit higher, and everyone based on their climate, and kind of be able to thrive as a civilization. And then we took off. But during all those times of volatility, the human race was suffering, really.
So well, that's okay. There's a lot to unpack here. I want to build something else first, and then I want to go into what you just said and unpack that a little from my perspective. But first, there is a way of building houses which is called Earthship, which uses passive solar, much like a greenhouse. And in combination with that, it uses thermal mass to store energy, to store heat, basically. So combining those two in a new form of greenhouse, which is basically not on the ground, but in the ground, and just covered by a sheet of transparent material that allows sunlight to go in but not out. reduces the need for energy in greenhouses. Now, if you pair that with, let's say, the food consumption in a city like Berlin, you could imagine a ring around Berlin, around the city, approximately 200 meters deep, of greenhouses like that, and that could feed the entire city. And in a greenhouse, you can regulate your temperatures, right? Even in a lo-fi version, like I just described. So you can start producing things you otherwise would not be able to produce properly in regions where you cannot do this at the moment. So it's entirely possible, and with a very, very low material and energy footprint. That's important, right? That's very, very important.
Indeed, and I live in Portugal, in case we haven't mentioned that, surrounded by many farms, permaculture farms, very many communities trying to be independent and grow everything on their own, and to be, these kind of standalone units. Maybe we could dedicate a whole session to how difficult that is, and the learnings that they have after 30, 40 years of doing that. And even in these cases, there are things, even communities that are radically and extremely committed to this principle, they still have not managed to create everything they need on their own. So it may be possible. That's one question we don't know yet. The question of, is it what we want, is another question. If you ask these people, is this the good solution? Is this where we should go as society? I think is more a philosophical kind of question. There are, I think, strong reasons to believe that trade and travel and intermixing of communities and what they create, if it's monitored and not taken out of control like it is today, are actually beneficial to a stronger global community. That's something we should be going to. So there are questions, I think, about global governance around this. And if we want to live in secluded, cut off, basically independent communities, or not. And that, I think, is perhaps a philosophical question, and also a personal one. I think there's a wide diversity there. I don't know. I know you subscribe to the local pirate approach.
It's both, really, right? It's because of the necessity of eating, having food, having sufficient energy, housing, all of the lower level needs on the Maslow scale, or any other categorization for that matter, have a deep connection to the local and to the people of the local. But it is at the same time true that as systems grow, they increase in efficiency. So biological organisms increase in efficiency at around a rate of 25% for each doubling. Whereas things like cities increase in efficiency at a rate of 15% in doubling. And you can measure that for a city, for example, in creative output, and this you can measure in number of patents or number of crime, right? So both is important. We need to have this layer of massive combination and recombination of ideas and cultures and people and etc. And at the same time have our physical domain really rooted in the in the local. And yes, of course, there can be exchange, but let's take this example of coffee. I mean, we're tracing caffeine in the oceans now because everybody's going to Starbucks all the time. Is that good? Is that healthy for the planet or the people? No, not really. So yes, let's have coffee everywhere. Let's distribute some coffee all over the globe, but let's have coffee from time to time, right? Let's really cherish these things that are special, instead of having an abundance of them all day, every day, on one small part of the planet, roughly 10% of the global population, or maybe 20, while the others can hardly eat. Right? That does not make any sense from any perspective, especially if you look at the global interconnectivity. And there's one interesting indicator to that. There's a book that came out, I think, about 15 years ago, which is called Towards Sustainable Agricultural Systems in the 21st Century, which was in part financed by the Gates Foundation. And one of the most interesting findings in that really massive book, I think it's 600 pages or something, is the exponential rise in CSAs, in community-supported agricultural systems in the United States. So that's been detected since the 80s, and it's a doubling every 5 years or so since then. And this solves many of the issues you were discussing earlier for the farmers, which are access to
for farmers in rich countries. Sorry, because CSAs, and whoever doesn't know this, it's kind of let's call it a farm to house kind of like a face-to-face kind of relationship with farmers around you, not through the grocery shop or the supermarket. And what you're talking about, this exponential growth in CSAs across the US and I think now in Europe as well, is really about really high income consumers. So if you look at the segment of who is participating in CSAs, they are the richest level of the population in the US, which is the richest country in the world. So it is important to take that into context, because cooperatives, and I was going to mention that across the world, most of the agriculture sector is organized in cooperatives already. And I mean, of above 90% of the smallholder farmers are organized in cooperatives. And this is the reigning, like the king entity where all farmers work in. And it's very, very common already. That's all I wanted to say. In the US, it got destroyed, and now it's kind of coming back.
I agree that probably there's two ways to look at this. One way is what you said. It's maybe more geared towards affluent populations. Maybe this is not entirely evident. This is not entirely evident, but what is absolutely evident is that the more labor-intense farming practices that that come with more regenerative, syntropic, permaculture ways of farming can only be sustained if you cut out the middleman. Now, the middleman doesn't like that, of course, right? And cutting out the middleman in that case means selling directly to the people. Now, I hate overusing that here, but the food prices in Costa Rica are incredibly high compared to other costs like rents. And we here receive food from a CSA, and it does not cost more than going to the shop. I repeat that, it does not cost more than going to the shop. So it's not a luxury to do this. And so there is a one specific cooperative that decided to go down that route. Everybody else is still producing coffee for the Germans. Okay. Now, the question that I asked is, what if the other cooperatives, instead of producing coffee, also started producing that kind of stuff? And they can still produce 10% coffee. And then they would, by the way, very likely improve their income if they reduce the amount of coffee, because it's very much sought after, so they can actually use the market in their advantage. So that's the real question, and I see similar things in Africa. So why?
So here's a little cute anecdote. So I spent a lot of time in Tanzania and Kenya, East Africa, one of the biggest coffee producers in the world as well. And a good friend of mine who's originally from, rural Tanzania, grew up in a family that was coffee farmers, and then kind of got excited about studies and then moved to London, and I met her there. I traveled with her to her home family in the mountains of Tanzania, and was so amused to find out that they treat coffee like beans. Right? Kenya, Tanzania, all of East Africa was colonialized by the British. What you drink there in the morning is tea. Nobody touches the coffee. Most people that farm the coffee don't even know that this is a stimulant, a drink with caffeine. It is really not touched. And if you do make it for them, it's incredible coffee. They don't actually... They don't like it. On the other hand, I worked there with her through this sustainable farming initiative that, again, their whole village was working with this cooperative that made sure that everyone had pretty good, very good conditions, and children couldn't work, and there was a whole school program around these people, and very much focused on sustainability of the entire ecosystem. If you would take away the coffee industry, the global coffee industry, there would be literally millions of Tanzanians without income at all. This is what they do. This is what they've done for decades. And they are actually living a good life. I said, their children are all going to get secondary education. They're growing. Their wealth, objective wealth is actually stronger. And so I believe we can contain a global system, and I agree it's ridiculous. We're watching the show, the boats shipping coffee. I think that's a bad thing. We can move to a better thing that still allows this kind of ability of, if you don't have a local market for something, but you do have access to a local crop that other people around the world are interested in, we could find a way to allow that kind of trade, and I'm not saying it's the only way. I think it's something we can connect with. I'll also mention that a key part of what you mentioned is have available income of the local community. So I mean, you're German living in Costa Rica. I wonder how many of the fellow workers' families that worked with you on the coffee picking, how much money they have to buy from all the local farmers around them, and if they don't have available income, especially if they are on subsistence farming, meaning they actually don't have income, they create food, they eat it, that's it. Then
yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, I'm not talking about the poor Nicaraguan families that were picking coffee alongside me in that coffee plantation here, but they will probably not be able to buy a lot of food even from the shops here. You're right. But anybody who can go to the shop and buy food here, which is actually the majority, they can also afford to go to the CSA because it's no difference in price. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. So I think what we're going to is we'll need different solutions for different locations and differently for different levels of wealth. And if we go back to our hunger discussion, and that 1/3 of the world living in food insecurity, they are the ones that are like your Nicaraguan family picking with you. And that is 1/3 of the world, 1 out of 3 human beings, majority children, and vulnerable populations of different ways, do not have that, are not the ones that will be able to do that. So when we talk about, changing the system, I think we really, really have to pay attention to what system we're creating also for that 1/3, and not only for, the third in the middle or the top third that is absolutely can create local economies and has the available income to support local farmers. And that's amazing. But, maybe we need to talk about segmentation and different solutions for different groups. I think for many developing countries, the global trade in food really allowed them to rise. And I know Africa the best, so I keep giving examples for Africa, but Ghana is a great example. Ghana is about, I think, around 80% of the cacao trade is in Ghana. For a while, this kind of global trade was very exploitative, right? So the poorest people there were really suffering. The Western countries are taking in the profits, like you're talking about coffee. But in the 90s, as kind of a democratic wave washed over Ghana, and they had their first democratic elections in 94, and it went peacefully, they started reforming the market and slowly got more and more ownership of basically the whole cacao and chocolate trade. And we have, local, instead of young Western kind of students coming in to do fair trade and volunteer with local farmers, we have more and more local young people creating fair trade solutions within Ghana. Local Ghanaian factories doing the post-production of the cacao beans. And really, the country has really taken off. This has been a great source of growth. And as it takes off and it's democratic, we see more and more rights and more education and more roads and much more health. The government has more taxes and has ability to create infrastructure. And there are a lot of issues as Ghana. I mean, I'm not saying this is like a model country, but we can see, instances of this global trade being exploitative, but we can see instances where the global trade is actually really helpful for a lot of really bad things. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if we can
but let's
solve that.
I think is worth a deep discussion, but I also think we should try and focus on how do we use tech specifically to move towards zero hunger, and there's right. I mean, the ultimate would be if we could just harvest CO2 from the atmosphere and turn that into food, but I think and there is I think a Swedish or Finnish startup working on exactly that. But
oh yeah, there is a bunch.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to kind of mention that currently we are in one of the biggest hunger crises since World War II, and that anyone who's listening, I don't know what's going to happen in a month or two. But if it's right now, if you're in April 2022, you should be aware that this disruption that happened right now with Ukraine and Russia fighting, and basically most of the crops for wheat being destroyed, is that we are in a huge food shortage, and it comes atop of
I want to add
global inflation.
I want to add one aspect to this, because Russia and Belarus are the prime providers of phosphorus, which is one core ingredient in the nutrients for industrial agriculture. Meaning,
well, phosphorus, yeah, for fertilizer.
Yeah, for fertilizer, right? So that means,
yeah. So that's the whole thing.
That there will be ripple effects downstream in half a year, 1.5 years, because crops simply aren't as productive because of that.
Aha. And here's where I will challenge you again. Just like the oil and gas basically that is produced in Russia and is now being disrupted by sanctions, etc. We can say that it will disrupt a lot of activity, but it also is a huge push towards looking for other sources of energy which exist that are not fossil fuels, that are actually destroying our planet. And the same thing I would say with anything related with chemicals and agriculture. There is a short-term benefit, of course, for chemical fertilizer, but it is one of, and we haven't talked about, I think it's SDG 13, life on land. It is the single most destructive thing that humans have done in terms of land. It is pouring these fossil fuel-based fertilizers on soils everywhere. It is destroying, and it's kind of relevant to this little graph we have here on diversity. There is a direct relationship between diversity and fertilizer. And there is a paradigm thinking the only way we can increase per crop yield is through these chemicals, these fossil-based chemicals. And that is absolutely not true. First of all, there is organic fertilizers. And I am, hoping and crossing my fingers right now that this giant disruption of the chemical-based fertilizers will start directing the world's eye to organic fertilizers, which are in many cases more effective, in many cases are byproducts from biogas or from different kind of organic. So they're absolutely renewable, they're regenerative, they're accessible everywhere. There's no need to have giant factories and to ship them around. So there may be a bright side that this market will take off because it's there, it's available, and not to mention there are other cool ways to increase crop that have nothing to do with fertilizers to increase yield. And that is one of the key things I wanted to talk about when we talk about startups and hunger. I can tell you, and I am not exaggerating, that at least once a week, I get contacted by some ag tech startup going, we will increase yield. Hence, we are related to SDG 2, increased hunger. And with every single one, I have to go through the process to ask them, very, very, very carefully, how, in any way, does your increased yield will address hunger? Because as we know, in Western markets, in the US and in Europe, a lot of the yield or a lot of the crops are wasted. They are either thrown away or they are sometimes even burnt because there is a government intervention here that promises farmers specific food or crops price. And if the market doesn't reach that price, the government will buy all the crops and burn them. We're at that level of waste and too much growing in Western markets. And so that's the key issue. Versus in developing countries, which don't have access to not the crops and not the products that are made. And so you're only relevant if you're a startup and you're thinking, am I relevant to this SDG? You're only relevant if you're very clearly connected to these markets, the markets where hunger exists. And we have this little map here. So if you're selling to farmers in the US, and those farmers, none of them in any way are selling their crops to developing countries or to world food programs that, you know, take these food and send it to these places, then in no way are you related to hunger. If anything, you might be contributing to it. And that's something that a lot of people in the agriculture world have an emotional issue with. They feel, if I am in this ag world, doesn't matter what kind, I am contributing to a good, I am supporting hunger and food production. But just like what we mentioned before, it really matters where and what we're doing. And I think a key issue is, you know, comparing the wheat grown in Ukraine and the wheat grown in the US. Because Ukrainian farmers are poor themselves, they are willing to sell their crops at a lower price point. And actually, they are the main supplier, over 90% of the supplier for the World Food Program. The World Food Program is this global organization run by the UN who feeds the people who are dying of hunger. And we can see where they are. They are in Yemen today, and look at this line in Africa, the line of the Sahel, where there's desertification and drought happening, and all across it, there are deep pockets of hunger. Notice that it's true about same places in South Africa, in South America. So this is absolutely a climate-related issue. It is absolutely something that globally we should be addressing, even though there's only a small geographic area that is really suffering from that. And what we find is that in countries like that, and Egypt is a key thing to note, is either they get aid from from countries that have extra, or you see the government buying mass amount of food. So Egypt is on the brink of disaster in terms of food. They have 100 million people, many of them on the brink of poverty, and the government actually supplies food or bread for its citizens. Well, it sells it for a very, very, very low amount. And right now they are living, you know, they still have some reserves and some in storage, but they are saying to the world now, in July, our storage ends, and 100 million people will be lumped in addition to be in hunger, because bread is very basic. So that's what, you know, Ukraine going on there. American farmers, if you're somehow connected to American farmers that are producing wheat, they do not sell to Egypt or the WFP because that is too low a price for them, because of the high intensive farming that they and the high income level standards that they're used to. It just doesn't make any sense. So this is like where we start seeing interesting issues about global trade and what does it mean when one place is now dealing with a crisis and a disaster. What do we do? Of course, the pandemic with the stopping of activity in all across the world hurt in many ways, mostly in the prices of inputs. You mentioned the phosphorus, but there are many inputs, from seeds to fertilizers to tractors. And anyone who's kind of dealing with food should know, or food production, there are 4 stations we have to remember. There is the growing of the food, there is the harvesting, there is the post-harvest storage, and there is the marketing. They're getting the food to us. And in each one of those stations, we need huge innovation. And that's kind of finally what we're going to talk about. And we, this is like key topics, you know, access, we mentioned at the beginning, access to services, to knowledge, distribution. And here are some key topics that have already some interesting ideas, and we'll just go to talk about them. Okay. There really is a big market around ag tech and tech solutions. I want to talk a little bit about big trends. So one of them is what we have here in the World Food Program. The World Food Program is one of the only UN agencies, and sorry if anyone here is listening from another UN agency, that has really embraced the idea of innovation. as a key approach to basically supply the service they're supposed to. The World Food Program is the one that we kind of say, if someone goes hungry, it's on you. And they're an independent agency, and they realize there's so many issues across that value chain that they need tech. And so they actually have an accelerator every year. They have work with hundreds of startups and different kind of tech innovation in order to bring this quickly and could bring systemic change quickly. And since they are kind of connected to all the value chains, all the supermarkets, all the retailers, everyone around, and the governments themselves, they can bring in cool solutions across the board. And if you are with them, it makes sense. And they have a lot of support there. They still will, if you're working with them at a startup, you still have to understand how this like government body works. It's procurement, it's top down, it's complex. It's not kind of a quick and easy business model. But they understand that, and they really try to help. I actually recently talked to the woman running their innovation accelerator, and she is very excited to hear more and more and more solutions. They also have money, so they actually invest in these kind of solutions. I know the World Food Program, one of the first to start this process of really connecting with the tech world, but in the food world, it's actually quite more common, and it's being picked up. Another big organization is called the FAO, it's the Food and Agriculture Organization. They also have an accelerator program, and they're looking for tech innovation. And I've seen Care International is going into it, and so any big philanthropy development agency that talk about food and poverty is beginning to understand that they actually need the tech guys engaged. And so when I was looking for actual startups, I couldn't find many. I could find a lot of projects that are these development agencies kind of calling out to the tech industry, like, we need your help. And they implement their innovations. It's not necessarily a startup that is born there. They just take the innovation and integrate it into their system. So there are not too many independent startups. And that's a big trend there. I mean, not too many. There's still many, but nothing stands out as like a winner here. I think it's an important trend to notice, if you care about this stuff, that there are integrators into this whole world, because as we started talking about it, it's super complex and very big. And I'm going to want to mention a couple that I know. As in the other ones, we are focused here on developing countries because that is where the hunger is, most of it. But we have a few kind of solutions that are looking at hunger in Western or richer countries. One of them is Phoenix. Phoenix is a French app that actually got a lot of attention recently, because they try to address the food loss issue. So that in rich countries, there is food loss everywhere, from the buyer to the supermarket. The buyer loses a lot along the way. The supermarket throws a lot of food. There's a whole issue of rich consumers not liking certain amount of crops because they're not pretty, or they're not round, or the color isn't perfect. And so there's a large amount that gets thrown out just because of aesthetics. There's another amount that gets thrown out because of commercial reasons, with fake expiry dates. And then whatever is brought home, we as consumers throw out around a third. So every stage of the process, about a third is thrown out. On the other hand, there are people who are vulnerable, anywhere from undocumented workers to just poverty, real poverty in Western markets, that don't have access to food. And Phoenix tries to close that chain. It's an app that they work with restaurants and with supermarkets that any food they're about to throw out, they collect, and very quickly find a local consumer for that food. So and try to close the loop locally. They have just raised, I think, $15 million. They're growing quite well. And it's an interesting model. What I found is interesting, as you see in Paris, like young students are starting to, buy their food on Phoenix as well. Or anyone who's just lower income and doesn't want to spend a lot on food can start going to these kind of solutions. And this whole thing about saving food, there's Robin Hood approach or food saving, and trash diving, dumper diving it's called, I think, where people are looking at the food that has been thrown out and going, this is actually very much usable, and trying to reduce basically the waste and the loss and throwing away food. I'll also mention part of this is fueled by climate change or climate crisis focus, since the food industry is responsible for over 35% of global emissions. And so it's even more jarring to throw that out. We're creating so much destruction. We talked about fertilizer, not to mention all the rest of the CO2 that gets released, and then we just throw it away. And so both from the poverty issue and the climate issue, we see more and more people looking at reducing that food waste and increasing efficiency. I'll mention one more. Farmster is a great innovation led by Harvard grad kind of data analyst and a local Tanzanian, which tries to kind of go to the point, I think, that you were mentioning, Thomas. They're trying to connect the local grower, specifically the smallholder grower. Again, care about food and you care about innovation, look at the smallholders, and try to connect them with actual buyers, local buyers. Not necessarily just the local families who live around them. Again, they don't have a lot of income, but the local supermarkets and the big buyers in the supermarkets are usually, these guys who have a relationship with a giant plantation. If I need to buy 3,000 tons of tomatoes over, a season, because that's how much I need. If I have a chain of supermarkets and I'm a buyer, I'm not looking to buy, a little pack with smallholder farmers. I need bulk. I need a massive amount. And so I have a relationship with a big plantation, and it's kind of a commercial relationship. Sometimes I front up the money and say, like, here's all you need in order to grow this amount of tomatoes. And so those big plantations are even more kind of doing it even better than, because they have no risk. And the smallholder farmer, which is making maybe better tomatoes, definitely needs that money more, definitely needs that income more, has no access to that whole value chain. So Farmster tries to connect the buyers, these buyers of big retailers, with smallholder farmers through an app. So basically, smallholder farmers can say how much they're planning to, how much they just planted and how much crop they're expected to have in 3 months, and the price that they're willing to sell it for. And together that can bulk up to a big amount. And so a buyer can, instead of going to these giant plantations, go to smallholder farmers. It has another kind of added value of smallholder farmers kind of getting a chance to get access to knowledge, which is, what is the right price of a ton of tomatoes? I don't know. If I'm not living in these markets, it's very hard for me to know the price fluctuations and how much I should sell it for. What we do see today is big buyers kind of exploiting that situation, and they go to smallholder farmers who's just harvesting, and they go, I'll take all of that for $100. And the smallholder farmer doesn't know, is that a good price, is that a bad price? Do they even have a choice? And so that kind of removal from market information is actually another giant hurdle the smallholder farmers have. And so Farmster tries to both connect, like, directly the buyers to the smallholder farmers, and also remove that level. Last point, tea food. And actually, you know what? I do want to mention carbon storage and carbon capture. So I'll mention that too, even though we don't have an example. Tea food looks at traceability across the value chain. Again, this is a blockchain solution, but it goes back to understanding what happens with our food and also trying to reduce the immense amount of loss that we have in our food chains. In general, I'd say that, the value chains in the food and agriculture markets are the most traditional and unmodernized as possible. So here, just having traceability and knowing where our food came from, I think this could definitely contribute to less Nicaraguan family working at $2 a day if, the rich end user knows exactly what plot that coffee came from and who was working there. Having access to all that information, knowing who created our food and when and what happened around it, is something that the richer markets are willing to pay for, but don't actually have a technological solution to have that. And T Foods tries to do that and is actually working on different kind of solutions to do that. Gonna kind of mention a couple things. So we have precision agriculture. It's a big trend in agriculture, and it is trying to address, again, a little bit what you mentioned, Thomas, about how we offer local solutions for local problems. Because farmers today, there's, let's say, some kind of pest, and we will just plaster our entire fields and all our plots with pesticide because we don't know for sure where exactly it is. Or we have some kind of need for more water, more fertilizer, and we just uniformly do it everywhere. That's what we do. Precision agriculture allows sensors, either through little things we put in the soil or drones to see what's going on in the different parts of the field, to know what exactly each tree or each part of the crop needs and be able to really focus on that. Not surprisingly, precision agriculture is kind of really geared towards the large plantations who have a really hard time managing thousands and thousands of hectares. But it's also completely relevant for smaller holders. And one more thing, biotech, I think, is really interesting. And I'll mention a company I know is called BioAg. And yeah, not a very innovative name, but BioAg is actually looking at the microgia mushroom that lives under the soil. And for a long time, we didn't really know that it's there. But apparently in soil that hasn't been toiled too much, it is in most of the soil on the planet, and really functions as in a really amazing kind of support system for the roots. It feels the root. I'm gonna stop sharing. So this incredible mushroom actually, or fungi, knows what's going on with the root and is very close to it and can actually direct little bits of nutrients, like precision agriculture, exactly to the root based on what they need. So if this root needs nitrate, this mushroom knows how to do it. But in our massive industrial agriculture work, if anyone has seen ever a farm, they know that one of the things we do is we till the land, and we, especially with machinery, really turn over the soil, which has its benefit. But in most of this kind of commercial agriculture, it means that we killed that mushroom. And so we have different kind of agriculture, biological solutions that we see, like a company like biotech bringing back that mushroom into the soil. And instead of selling fertilizer, they sell basically pieces of soil with that fungi, which is found to be actually very effective in creating better crops and more resilient crops and more yield. And last but not least, carbon capture. There is a question of, can we take carbon molecules and store them in the land? And that is a way for farmers to kind of get access to carbon revenue and to sell the carbon that they are saving. There is a potential for that, I'll mention, but I would say there's a lot of kind of talk about that, but it's not quite clear we can reach that potential today, mostly because of how the carbon markets and the carbon mechanisms work, where we need to verify what's going on and how much carbon is actually captured. And since we have huge variances in the level of the soil, so soil that has been tilled very often and the topsoil is quite nutrient free and is only working based on nutrients, is very porous, meaning you put the carbon there, there's a high chance it will go back up to the atmosphere. The more the soil is dense and full of nutrients and kind of deeper, then there's a better chance for carbon capture and sequestration. And currently, yeah, you mentioned there's a Finnish company that's doing that. There's different kind of initiatives trying to do it. I haven't seen it at scale, but I think there is a lot of interest around farmers, especially in Western countries, that have realized that agriculture may or may not be a viable kind of activity in a post-industrial society, are looking for more income and are very, very excited about being that. Maybe we can't produce food on a good price level, but at least we can store carbon. So
Vita is actually running a project with an organization that does that.
Absolutely.
They're called Plan Boo. And what they do is they help currently in Malaysia, they help tea plantations create biochar from bamboo. That in the process of creating the biochar is the excess heat is used for drying the tea leaves. And then the biochar is applied to the soil, which improves the retention capacity of the soil, meaning there's more nutrients, more liquids that actually stay in the ground, and at the same time you can
absolutely
you can prove how much carbon you actually sequester, and sell that on the markets.
Yeah, and I think bamboo is super exciting. There is a lot of potential for these issues in developing countries. I think where the soil hasn't been destroyed really by intensive agriculture for decades. And I think that's somewhere to look at. Yeah.
So again, we find that there's a lot of systemic interconnection here. You touch on one thing, and we haven't really spoken about nutrition or how much food does a person need per day.
That's true.
We went directly to the source of creating food, right? So that's to me shows how absolutely critical this is. I'm really, really looking forward to exploring the remaining 14 SDGs, because we have covered 1, 2, and 3 now. To see, is there some combining? Of course, there's a lot of combining, but is there something that emerges out of these conversations that helps us to make better decisions about where we put our innovation power and money? And so yeah, thank you once again for that amount of time. We're almost at 2 hours now.
Yeah,
that's
a long one. One thing I will kind of throw out there is that the key part is to really understand who we are touching with our technology, who is buying it, who is selling it, who is going to be involved in it, and to go to that level down from the sector we're in, which is where we usually like to talk about in tech, like that, the general sector. We're in ag tech, so it's fine. And I think, as you know, if I was the trends we'll find along this conversation is how important that kind of focus is. Yeah, sorry, I had to kind of mention.
No, of course, that's important. We don't have to finish now if there's more to say. I just noticed the time and thought, maybe it's wise.
No, we are absolutely ready. Yeah. I think when in the YouTube link, I'll throw in some resources because really we didn't talk about nutrition and there's a lot going on there. Mm-hmm. And we didn't talk about diversity in species diversity, which is also super interesting. And you know, if we had another 5 hours, we probably could cover all of that.
Oh, we can revisit this SDG, but let's dig our way through the rest first. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.